Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take sources you send us and, well, pull out the crucial bits of the knowledge you need, quick and thorough.
And today, we're really getting into it.
Yeah, today, specifically for you, we're diving headfirst into Whitley Strieber's book, Them. It's quite thought-provoking, came out around March last year, maybe a little unsettling, too.
Definitely unsettling in parts. Our mission here, our focus for this deep dive, is really nailing down the central point of Them. Strieber sets it up as like a pioneering investigation.
Right.
He calls it the first comprehensive look into something absolutely key.
Mm-hmm.
The intent behind these encounters, well, he calls them visitors, non-human intelligences.
So not just what happened, but why it happened.
Exactly. That's the core question, the why.
And what I find compelling is how he builds his case. It's all grounded in these experiential accounts, right, from both civilians and military folks who've had close encounters.
He's taking those firsthand stories, what people say happened to them, as his raw data.
Which is interesting in itself.
And we should definitely mention the framing right at the start. There's a preface by Mitch Horowitz and a foreword by Dr. Jacques Vallée.
And these aren't just quick blurbs, are they?
Not at all. They really set the stage, intellectually speaking, for what Strieber's trying to do in the book.
Okay, let's unpack that framing a bit. Horowitz, in the preface, he makes this really striking comparison.
He does. He puts them on a similar level, interpretively, to Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia.
Which was back in, 1969? That's a big statement for anyone familiar with Vallée's work.
It really is. And the reason that comparison hits hard is because Passport to Magonia, well, it was groundbreaking. It connected modern UFO reports to, like, folklore, myths, fairy encounters.
Suggesting something deeper than just, nuts and bolts aliens from another planet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something maybe tapping into human consciousness or other dimensions, a much weirder, more profound phenomenon.
So Horowitz drawing that parallel, he's basically saying Strieber isn't just collecting stories.
Right. He's aiming for that same kind of deep interpretation, trying to decode the meaning, the significance of these interactions, and especially that focus on intent. It's suggesting we're dealing with something really complex, maybe not just physical.
Okay, and then Vallée's foreword. You said it offers a slightly different angle.
Yeah, Vallée brings in this emphasis on data, on evidence. He highlights that Strieber's book cites fact after fact.
And by facts, he means these witness accounts.
In this context, yes, the experiential reports. Vallée, being a scientist known for his, rigorous look at UAPs, is pointing out that Strieber's investigation is built on this body of reported experience.
Which gives it a certain weight within the field anyway, even if the stories are often anecdotal.
It does. And Vallée connects this directly to policy. He says this evidence supports a call for the realignment of public policy with public need.
Realignment of policy. So this isn't just academic curiosity for Vallée.
No, it implies these encounters have real-world effects and that, governments, society, we need to actually deal with this based on what the patterns in the reports are telling us.
Got it. So the setup is Horowitz pushing for deep meaning and interpretation, Vallée grounding it in reported facts and linking it to potential policy changes. It's framing them as a book that wants to both understand and potentially change things.
That's a great summary of the initial framing. Powerful stuff.
So where does Strieber go from there? Part 1 delves into civilian encounters.
Right, that's the next step. Part 1 focuses specifically on civilian experiences, trying to decipher what contact actually means. He looks closely at, I think, 11 specific cases.
And these cases came from letters he received after communion, his own book, right?
Exactly. So these are people who resonated with his story and felt they needed to share their own experiences with him. A specific kind of data set, you could say.
And the goal there was ambitious.
Very. He aimed to create what he calls the first in-depth picture of what contact signifies, and crucially, to start figuring out visitor intentions from these accounts.
So what themes emerged? Was it straightforward?
Oh, definitely not straightforward. The first thing that jumps out is just the sheer high strangeness and complexity. These aren't simple abduction scenarios.
How strange are we talking? The outline hinted at some really bizarre stuff.
Yeah, really bizarre. Like, one case involves an entire family having an encounter together in broad daylight, not just seeing something, but interacting.
Wow. Okay.
And this is an account of someone fighting off what they perceived as like ultimate evil during the night. Very intense, psychological, maybe physical too. And a mother and daughter sharing an experience inside some kind of object, which is then connected later to the child developing a fatal illness.
It's chilling.
It is. And maybe the weirdest, a man watching his friend literally transform into something else and then just
Vanish.
gone. These stories really push the limits of what we think is possible,
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
reality bending doesn't even quite cover it. So, from these kinds of strange, disturbing accounts, what did Stryber conclude about visitor intent? Is it all bad news?
Well, the key thing is he doesn't paint them with one brush. It's not one entity, one goal.
Mm.
He suggests there could be different groups, maybe factions.
With different agendas?
Yeah, possibly even conflicting agendas. You might have some with, let's say, noble aims, maybe helping humanity evolve or sharing knowledge. But then others, maybe they're just indifferent or manipulative, treating us like,
Playthings.
that's the word used, like playthings in some cosmic game we don't understand.
Which brings us back to that uncomfortable question. Are they a threat? Sounds like Stryber leans into the darker possibilities.
He definitely explores them. Although, interestingly, he apparently notes a drop-off in abduction reports more recently.
Oh, what does he make of that?
He speculates it might mean they aren't, harvesting people on a large scale for food or biological material or whatever scary idea was out there.
Okay, so maybe not that kind of threat.
Maybe not. But the question of threat in other ways, manipulation, psychological impact, maybe even societal disruption, that remains very much on the table in his analysis.
And then there's this concept of controlled memory. That sounds really mind-bending. What's that about?
Yeah, this is where it gets incredibly tricky. Stryber puts forward the idea that our memories of these encounters, they might not be accurate recordings.
Not just fuzzy, but deliberately changed.
Or even implanted.
Yeah.
By the visitors themselves. Makes you question everything, really. The whole foundation of witness testimony.
Why would they do that? Manipulate memories.
Well, he suggests a couple of possibilities. Maybe it's altruistic, like softening the memory to reduce trauma, make it easier for us to cope.
Okay, that's one possibility.
The other, maybe more likely, or at least more worrying, is that it's strategic. They could be shaping our perception of them, feeding us a particular narrative for their own purposes.
Wow. That completely messes with our ability to figure out what's real, doesn't it? If the memories themselves might be part of the phenomenon or the manipulation.
Exactly. It's a massive epistemological problem. How do you figure out the true intent if your primary data source, the witness memory, might be actively compromised by the very intelligence you're studying?
It's like trying to read a map drawn by someone who wants you to get lost.
That's a good analogy. It creates this fundamental uncertainty.
So besides this memory issue, does Stryber try other ways to understand visitor behavior, even the really weird stuff?
He does try. There's an effort to sort of reinterpret their actions, to see if there's a logic, maybe an alien logic, behind what seems irrational or bizarre to us.
Yeah.
Trying to understand it from their potential perspective.
Looking for patterns in the chaos, maybe?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, so part 1. Deep dive into civilian accounts. High strangeness. Questions about intent. Memory manipulation. A lot to process. Then part 2 shifts focus to the military.
Correct. Part 2 moves from those individual stories to the bigger picture of military engagement with UAP, going all the way back to 1947, Roswell era, and onwards.
And this is where he introduces that really controversial idea about secrecy.
This is it. Stryber makes a central argument here that the secrecy surrounding UAPs in government wasn't just a human decision. He claims the visitors themselves actively maneuvered governments into a position where secrecy became essentially mandatory.
Whoa, hang on. So the usual ideas, fear of panic, keeping tech secret, national security Stryber saying that's not the whole story, or even the main story.
He's suggesting the primary driver was external, that the visitors somehow compelled or forced the secrecy issue for their own reasons.
That completely flips the script. Instead of humans deciding to hide it, it's the visitors wanting it hidden, using governments to do it.
That's the core of his argument in this section. It reframes the whole history of government secrecy around this topic.
But how? How could they compel that? And why would they want human governments to enforce secrecy? That implies a level of influence or control. That's pretty staggering.
It does. The book explores these questions naturally. The how and why remain speculative, of course, but the implication is that the secrecy serves the visitor's agenda, maybe lets them operate more freely without public scrutiny. It points to a very unequal power dynamic.
Unequal is probably an understatement. And what about the actual military interactions? Does he get into the consequences?
Yes, he discusses the effects of these encounters, especially when they involve conflict or near-conflict situations, how those shaped policy, the protocols that developed.
And the impact on the people involved, the military personnel.
Absolutely, the human cost. The psychological and sometimes physical effects on service members who had these direct, often terrifying and unexplained run-ins.
Does he try to figure out why conflict even happened, why these confrontations arise?
Yes, he digs into the potential causes. And a theme that comes up again, linking back to the civilian accounts, is this huge difficulty in communication.
Ah, the communication barrier. Because we just think differently, fundamentally differently.
That seems to be the core idea. Enormous difficulty of communication between species with differently structured brains, is how it's put. Misunderstandings, misinterpretations. Action seen as hostile might not have been intended that way, or vice versa.
Because the basic operating systems are just incompatible, maybe?
Potentially. But importantly, Straber apparently also looks at ways this communication gap might be recognized, maybe even bridged or worked around.
So there's a hint of optimism there, that it's not all inevitable conflict based on misunderstanding.
A hint, perhaps. It suggests that if we understand the communication problem itself, maybe we can find better ways to interact, or at least interpret actions more accurately. It allows for non-malevolent interpretation sometimes.
Okay, so if we try to pull all these threads together, what are the absolute core takeaways from them?
I'd say a few things really stand out. First, the sheer complexity and ambiguity of the visitors. They're not presented as simple, unified,
Yeah.
anything, really. Intentions are murky, could be good, bad, indifferent.
And the question, are they a threat, looms large. Maybe the ambiguity is the point.
That's definitely suggested. Second, that radical idea about secrecy, that it's visitor-driven, serving their interests primarily.
Like a huge claim.
Massive.
Yeah.
Third, that communication break down the cognitive divide as a fundamental obstacle to clear understanding and peaceful relations.
Makes sense.
And fourth, just embracing the high strangeness, the reality-bending nature of it all, the memory manipulation possibility. It forces questions about perception, reality itself, even links to other big mysteries like death and consciousness.
It really pushes boundaries.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what's Strieber trying to achieve with this book after decades of thinking about this?
I think the goal is synthesis. He's trying to bring together everything he's learned and experienced to create a foundational vision of contact, a framework to help us start understanding what he sees as this really confused, sometimes violent and fraught relationship between us and them.
So less about definitive answers, more about a new way to ask the questions.
Exactly. Hal Puthoff is quoted as saying something similar, that the book's real value is in raising these deep, provocative questions, not necessarily resolving them.
Just acknowledging how much we don't know.
And appreciating the depth of the complexity. That seems key.
Okay, well, our deep dive into them definitely surfaces some heavy concepts that focus on visitor intent, the idea of visitor-driven secrecy, the communication chasm, the sheer weirdness.
Yeah, it's certainly a book that, as Puthoff suggested, probably leaves you with more questions than answers. But maybe that's the point, to make us think harder about reality, intelligence, what contact could even mean.
And that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listener, to mull over. If Stryber is right, or even partially right, about the possibility of controlled memory and about these profound communication barriers, how could we ever be truly certain about what these encounters are, what the intentions behind them really are? What would proof even look like in a reality that might be subtly or not so subtly manipulated?
It's a deep rabbit hole indeed. Something Strieber's work really invites you to ponder, maybe even dive into his book or related research yourself.